all of you for joining me today. Is the sound okay on your end? Just give me some nods and let me know. Okay,
That
very
sounds
good.
great.
Well, that's super. Let me just start off by saying that the Wildlife Center of Virginia may not be a household name there in Tucson, Arizona, but we are the world's leading teaching and research hospital for wildlife and conservation medicine. Now, okay, that sounds pretty esoteric, but what that means is that we train fourth year vet students who are interested in wildlife medicine from every veterinary school in the United States and Canada, and from 40 other countries that come here to our facility in Waynesboro, Virginia, located in the Shenandoah Valley. And they learn to apply their general veterinary skills to the very, very specialized world of wildlife and conservation medicine. And by conservation medicine, that's actually a term that has morphed into a new phrase. The term of art today is called One Health. And essentially what that means is there are fields of specialty, but in looking at One Health, we recognize that animal health, environmental health, and human health are just inseparably linked and connected. And you cannot really look at the health of a person without thinking about their environment. And as we're seeing from this pandemic, it's certainly the health of animals, animal diseases, passing, mutating, changing, being jumping the species barrier into humans. These are all things that are happening with greater frequency around the world, and we need to pay very close attention to them. And here at the Wildlife Center of Virginia, that we're in our 39th year of operation. That's one of the things in which we specialize. So in addition to teaching undergraduate students, or I say undergraduate, fourth year vet students who are still in vet school, we also do postdoctoral internships, fellowships, and residencies. We're doing a lot of clinical studies and publishing extensively in peer-reviewed scientific journals about what we find. And essentially our premise is we use the individual case histories of the animals that come through our doors. And last year was almost 4,000 patients came in here to really provide a window on the environment, if you will. We get a lot of common stuff. We get a lot of baby squirrels that fall out of trees, and you know, we don't have a whole lot to learn there. But we also get a lot of rare species. We get a lot of novel problems. We were the first to identify West Nile virus here in the state of Virginia, because when it had first emerged in the United States in 1998, it was in the corvids in New England, the crows and jays and ravens. But by the time it got here to Virginia, those populations of corvids had taken such a big hit that the disease jumped into great horned owls and red-tailed hawks. And indeed, we documented that, we monitored that, and we found that indeed that disease had a population level effect on the species. We corroborated our findings with the Christmas bird count, actually, that was done. And we found that the increase in the number of patients we had here at our hospital tracked precisely with the decrease in population in the wild that was documented during the Christmas bird count. So what we are is hard science with a soft heart. We care for individual animals, but we also are looking at their situation in a larger context. So if an animal comes in, yes, we try to save its life. We do state-of-the-art medicine here. But if we learn why the animal came in and gather enough information to go address that problem in the wild, even if we lose the patient, it's not a lost cause and it's not a failed encounter. So that's where we are. And so that's sort of the context that I'll share with you today. Now, the program that I want to share with you is just a glimpse and a very brief glimpse at what's going on with the bald eagle. Obviously, since I'm here in Virginia, a lot of the examples I use in this program will be from the East Coast, but it's just as relevant to Arizona or California or Washington State or Minnesota. The problems that we're seeing in these bald eagle populations around the country are the same. And we're seeing the bald eagle exemplify environmental problems that are affecting others. And certainly in the Case of the bald eagle, I'll be talking a lot about lead poisoning today, and certainly the California condor reintroduction in northern Arizona was a driving influence and truly raising and elevating the awareness of lead toxicity in birds of prey and in scavenging birds. So with that, I'm going to try to share my screen here and see if that works. Luke, you're going to have to talk to me here. Is that working?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Look at that.
Well,
All right.
I actually don't see it. So I think if you go back to your Zoom screen.
All right.
And you should have the little green button that says share screen.
Share screen.
And then it'll give you a choice of which.
Oh, look at that. All right. Share that. And we're going to share it that way.
Yep. And then you just start there you go.
All right. Are we there?
Yep.
See, I'm learning something today too. I always like doing these things. I take home as much knowledge as I bring. So when I talk about bald eagles being back from the brink, and it's an unfinished story, I mean that. It's bald eagle conservation is a good news, bad news situation. And before I get started, I do want to thank the Tucson Audubon Society for inviting me, but also kind of my co-sponsors, if you will, my dear friends with the Friends of the Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge, were actually the ones that reached out to me and hooked me up with Luke, and an organization for which I have a warm spot in my heart, and love the refuge and love the work that they're doing there. But as we think about eagles, eagle, kind of big E, little e, has a lot of implications, and it goes back in significance through history. You found Roman legions marching behind the gold emblem of the eagle. You find motorcycles named after them, beer cans named after them, and my particular favorite, 10-year-old single barrel bourbon named after it, just so happens is my favorite bourbon, not because of the name, but the taste. You find clothing lines, you find military units, you find fraternal organizations. Indeed, the highest honor in the Boy Scouts of America is to become an Eagle Scout. And football teams. And indeed, of course, the bald eagle is on the symbol of the United States of America. And if you've never learned about that symbol, it's actually pretty interesting. It was adopted in 1782. And can you see my arrow here? There are 13 stars in the cluster above the eagle. There are 13 leaves on the olive branch and 13 olives between the leaves. And there are 13 arrows clutched in the fist. So the symbol is we are one nation of 13 colonies, offering peace, wanting peace, believing in peace, but willing to fight if called upon to do so. So it's actually a pretty interesting thing, and the eagle was a good choice. Now, as I'm sure you know, all the stories, Benjamin Franklin wanted the turkey as the national symbol, and depending on your politics, some of us could see that on the presidential seal from time to time, but I'll leave that up to you to decide whether it was in the past or in the present, and we'll move right along. The bald eagle is indeed an iconic species. Now, as I mentioned, it was chosen as our national symbol in 1782. Now, that was when we as a nation really established ourselves, and the Articles of Confederation were in effect, and it was our Congress at the time that selected the eagle to be the true image of ourselves. Now, it's also top of its food chain. And in most cases, eagles have very few natural predators, other than occasionally other eagles or the odd scavenger or predator that may raid a nest. But an adult eagle has little to fear from other creatures in the world, of course, except man. And they are found, indeed, in 49 of our 50 states. And so they really do represent the United States. They are not aggressive birds in the sense that you really don't need to worry about being attacked by an eagle, but they will fiercely defend their territory, their nests, and their mates and their young. So the olive branch and the arrows do indeed seem to work. Now, when we first got to North America with European colonization back in 1607 here in Virginia, there were an estimated 300,000 to 500,000 bald eagles living here. And that's just in the lower 48 states. Of course, Alaska wasn't in the mix back then. There were around the Chesapeake Bay, which is a prime eagle habitat, and probably the largest population of bald eagles in the eastern United States is found around the Chesapeake Bay and in the tidal rivers that feed the bay. An estimated 3,000 nesting pairs were there before we began altering the landscape. Now, they've suffered a lot over the years. Eagles have been subjected to just all kinds of indignities. They were shot, they were trapped, they were poisoned. There were bounties on them offered by some states, and oftentimes because of false narratives, if you will, in the sense that an eagle is a scavenger as much as it's a hunter. And if an eagle is found on a dead lamb, doesn't mean it killed the lamb, but you can bet the farmer's going to blame the eagle for a lamb that may well have died from other causes. Habitat loss has been a huge issue for eagles and remains a huge issue for eagles even today. Their primary habitat along tidal rivers and large bodies of water have been fundamentally altered. And of course, environmental contaminants have been a big problem, DDT being most notable among them. And DDT, of course, is credited with driving not only the bald eagle population to the brink of extinction, but brown pelicans, peregrine falcons, ospreys, and many other avian species that fortunately now seem to be recovering today. Now, the eagle population in the lower 48 states hit absolute rock bottom in 1963. In the lower 48 states, there were fewer than 500 nesting pairs. That averages, if it were spread evenly, just 10 pairs per state, just 20 birds. Now, some states had none. Some states like Virginia had a few more, but not many more. And the reproductive rate for bald eagles, and this was due in large part to the DDT, the chronic DDT exposure to which eagles were subjected, dropped to 0.2 chicks per nest, which really means you have to have 5 nesting pairs laying eggs, nesting, trying to incubate those eggs to even get one single chick that is viable. And of course, that rate was simply not sustainable. Now, we do have federal laws to protect bald and golden eagles. Migratory Bird Treaty Act, of course, was passed in the early part of the 20th century, more than 100 years ago now. And that was to protect bird species, as I'm sure you all know, from the very popular practices of feather collection and egg collection and nest collection. Natural history was indeed a very, very popular pastime, but the way people chose to pursue it is go out and kill something wild and bring it in and put it on display. The sale and trade of those things, the millinery industry, the ladies' hats in particular, the Carolina parakeet, truly driven into extinction because of their popularity as an ornament on ladies' hats. They killed them by the hundreds of thousands. And of course, we no longer have them today as a result of that very temporary fashion statement. The Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act in 1940 was really a wake-up call, because at that time we were still poisoning, shooting, and paying bounties on bald eagles that were bald and golden eagles, indeed, that were thought to be preying on livestock or chickens or whatever. But a predatory bird was a bad animal. It was the old fairy tale perspective that if it eats something else, it's bad. If it eats something I want to eat, it's even worse. And that really finally generated a reaction on the part of our policymakers. And this act was created simply to stop the trapping, poisoning, and shooting. The habitat was a long way from being protected. And then, of course, in 1972, we got the Endangered Species Act. And truly, the bald eagle was among the first species designated as an endangered species under the provisions of the Endangered Species Act, and it truly became the flagship species for endangered species conservation. And that conservation went on for a long time before it showed any positive results. Now, the major steps in the bald eagle recovery that we are experiencing across North America today certainly included more rigorous enforcement of laws to stop that deliberate, overt killing of individual animals. But that in and of itself simply wasn't enough. The biggest single thing that brought the bald eagle back from the brink of extinction was the elimination of DDT and its metabolite, DDE, which is what shows up in the bodies of intoxicated birds, eliminating that from US markets. And that took place in the early 1970s. Now, a lot of folks would be surprised to know that it did not take place because of the known impacts of DDT on bald eagles or peregrine falcons or brown pelicans or ospreys or any of the other avian species. It was because the National Institute of Health conducted a human tissue survey, and they found measurable residue of DDT and its metabolite DDE, which is what it turns into in the body, in 100% of the human tissue samples taken in 1972. 100%. So all of us who were alive at that time, certainly those of us who were been alive for a couple of decades by that time, we still have those residues in our body because there is no mechanism through which your body can eliminate organochlorine chemical residues. And it was in the act to eliminate a threat to human health that wildlife became the inadvertent and the ancillary beneficiary. Now, certainly other environmental protection laws have been critically important: the National Environmental Policy Act, Clean Water Act, various other federal legislation that has just made things better for everything that depends on the environment, including humans, but especially bald eagles. Since fish are their primary diet, the pollution in some of our rivers was just horrendous, and it rendered whatever food supply that might be available inedible and dangerous to eat. And certainly that was a huge issue here in Virginia, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the most important aspect that changed is public attitude. In the 1950s, wildlife was viewed as a commodity. You shot it, you hunted it, you wore it, whatever. If it was a problem animal, you got rid of it. In the 1960s and certainly into the 1970s, wildlife really changed in its valuation by the general public. And part of that is as a result of urbanization of human populations. And that urbanization eliminated the hands-on, day-to-day, real-world contact with wildlife, and wildlife became more of an abstract concept to most people. And you had programs like Wild Kingdom with Marlon Perkins and Jim Fowler and just a number of other people that went through there that really brought wildlife into our homes. Walt Disney certainly had many, many feature films that were anthropomorphic, without a doubt. In fact, Bambi is a 4-letter word here at the Wildlife Center of Virginia, but people began to see wildlife as something other than just a resource that was to be consumed by humans. Now, here in the Chesapeake Bay region, this is a bit of a timeline that shows how some of these changes took place. And the Chesapeake Bay, as I mentioned, is one of the most concentrated populations of bald eagles in the eastern United States. It's a destination for northern birds that migrate south. They come as far as the Chesapeake Bay. Our Chesapeake Bay birds that are here during the summertime, they will migrate south to Florida during the wintertime. So on any given day, it's possible to find now lots of bald eagles around the Chesapeake Bay, but from week to week, they may not be the same eagles, even those sitting in the same tree. And of course, right now, the nesting is actively underway. The pairs have reaffirmed their pair bonding, and nesting's taking place. And so very soon, when the females have laid their eggs and are on the nest, the aerial surveys will begin and we'll be keeping count. But as you can see here, we went to 2,000 pairs sometime back, and we are far beyond that. We estimate the population here in Virginia and the mid-Atlantic states is growing at a rate of about 10% per year. That's the good news. Here is the pathway of that across the lower 48 states. It was very slow. So the banning of DDT in the early 1970s showed very little result until the early 1980s. That's because it takes nearly 10 years for DDT in the environment to break down sufficiently to the point that it's no longer toxic and no longer an environmental threat. So it took 10 years. And then in the early 80s, we saw a precipitous jump, and it has continued to escalate ever since. Now, here in Virginia, as you can see from the graph, we've tracked pretty well with the federal trends, and we're pleased with that. Now, where I live, out in the Shenandoah Valley, out in the western part of Virginia, people say to me all the time, "Oh, isn't it great? I saw a bald eagle this morning. It's wonderful to have them back in the Shenandoah Valley." Well, the truth is, they're not back. They were never here before. They're here for the first time. And I'll talk about that again in a moment. Now, the James River, which is the main tidal river in the state of Virginia, and now our largest concentration of bald eagles, is a really good case study. And what we did to our most precious bird, to the very symbol of our nation, what we did in its most valuable and pristine habitats, and what hopefully we've learned from it. Now, as you will see, back in the early 1970s, in 1972, the last pair of nesting eagles on the James River left. And there were no known eagle nests until almost 1980, when one pair came back, and slowly, and again, as DDT left the environment, that trend has continued to escalate, and it increases exponentially. Now, one of the things that has happened is the available habitat filled up very quickly. Now, as we were studying this back in the 1980s, we doomsday prophets thought that once that eagle population got up and filled the habitat, that as the habitat subsequently was degraded by human development, that population would go down. Well, the truth is we didn't give the eagles enough credit. Now, they not only succeeded numerically, but in response to the loss of their primary habitat, they spread out. Now, this map shows the tidal portions of the James River and the city of Richmond, somewhere right about in here. And that is what we call here in Eastern Virginia at the fall line. This is the point at which the rivers coming out from the mountains down across the Piedmont reach literally the precipice, and there are waterfalls and rapids there, and that prevents anadromous fish from going upstream. The tide is no longer reflected in the movement of the water, and so everything downstream is the tidal river, which is primary eagle habitat. Everything upstream is the non-tidal river that is at best secondary habitat. Fewer fish, fewer diversity of smaller diversity of species, and just harder feeding all around. But in 1975, when we started to see a few birds come back, we were pretty encouraged. In 1995, 20 short years later, seeing eagles along the James River became a pretty easy thing to do. And you could go in there and really find quite a few of them. And then certainly 20 years after that, along the Rappahannock River and the James River, these particular nests were getting closer and closer together. The bird populations were more and more there. Now, I misspoke here. I'm looking at my own map here. It's been a while. This is not the James River, but the Rappahannock River. So this is the city of Fredericksburg right here. Richmond is a little further south, but this is a perfect example. Now, the Rappahannock River goes all the way up to about here, which is a stream you can step across that originates just outside Shenandoah National Park. And indeed, the population increase today has this almost a solid red color all the way along. Now, what's changed? Well, the eagles have changed, certainly. They have gotten used to people to the point that particularly around some of the urban areas, they nest in backyards. We get complaints, and the Department of Wildlife Resources gets complaints because a bald eagle has built a nest in a pine tree over somebody's swimming pool and keeps dropping fish heads in the pool. That's a pretty high-class problem, I will have to say, and they don't get a whole lot of sympathy from our state wildlife biologists, but it has really been exemplary. The problem is, as the eagles have gotten above this point, which is the tidal part of the river, up here, things have changed for them, not only in terms of the fact that it's not primary habitat, it's secondary habitat, but in terms of what's going on. Now, clearly, there are still many, many threats to our bald eagles. Power line collisions, especially with power lines going across the rivers, it's a big problem. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service threatened to bring criminal action against one of our state electric utilities because they didn't have their power lines marked well enough for eagles flying up the river to see them. Well, they're all very well marked now, and the number of collisions has dropped rather precipitously. Wind energy, as the proliferation of sustainable electricity generation is taking place across the country, these wind turbines are like big blenders, if you will, for not just eagles, but all migratory birds, and especially those that migrate at night, and especially for turbines that are located along the ridge tops of mountains here in the east, certainly out in the west. Those ridge tops with those updrafts and kind of perpetual wind streams coming through there, they're perfect for wind turbines, but they're also perfect for migratory birds. And it's a big issue. And the technologies are slow to develop because there frankly is just not much incentive for the power generation firms to improve their technology and their turbine design. Pardon me. Oil spills, water pollution, these types of events take a huge toll. I had the dubious honor of being on the damage assessment team for the Gulf oil spill. And it was heartrending to see the birds of all types of species washing up on the beaches, the fish that get contaminated. The eagle doesn't know it's contaminated. It comes along, eats that fish and ingests the whole cornucopia of toxic chemicals. These problems still exist. And while we do have laws against certain things, the enforcement of those laws is still needing some bolstering. Emerging diseases. I think I mentioned West Nile virus earlier. We have now seen cases where bald eagles are among the species that are indeed vulnerable to West Nile virus. We have had several here at the Wildlife Center. The fact that it is West Nile virus is confirmed by our human health department, with whom we work very, very closely. In fact, our state public health veterinarian is a member of our scientific advisory committee here at the Wildlife Center of Virginia. So when we need to find out what's going on, we have incredible resources available to us to be able to identify that. And in their vulnerability to these diseases, these animals, these species can indeed be sentinels to threats to human health, the canary in the coal mine, if you will. And I hate to say it, but it still continues. The illegal trafficking in eagle parts and eagles themselves, for not only for bona fide religious activities for Native Americans, but for the illegal and illicit activity for people who are not members of recognized tribes, not at least 1/8 full-blooded Native American, and not participating in legitimate religious or cultural activities. There's a lot of the Native American culture that has just become chic and become popular, and the trade in these animals is extensive. Now, I happen to know, because one of my fields of expertise, and Luke referred to my expertise, it's a fairly short description of what my expertise might really be. But one of the things I've spent the last 25 years working on is the valuation of bald eagles. What is an adult bald eagle worth? And how do you figure it out? And how do you apply that to criminal law? Well, in the cases of illegal trade, I appraised bald eagles the same way you'd appraise a house. What would it take to build a new house? Well, what does it take to breed a bald eagle in captivity and return it to the wild? Well, that's something we could figure out in terms of dollar values. All right, I'm dealing with a house. What is the cost of taking a house and making it new, an old house, and restoring it to a new full value? That's equivalent to the rehabilitation of bald eagles, taking an individual who is not viable in the wild or to its species and returning it to viability. Those costs are measurable as well. And then ultimately, for some species, not with bald eagles, what is a comparable sale price? And indeed, for golden eagles that are captively bred can be bought and sold for falconry or other purposes. And so the cumulative assessment of those values gave us the valuation of bald and golden eagles. So an adult bald eagle is valued at $10,000, a value that has been accepted by our federal court system. And a juvenile bald eagle, since they can range in age from hatchling to 4.5 years old, we just did a weighted average of $5,000 per bird. Now, so what? Well, the so what of it is, under the Uniform Sentencing Guidelines of federal law, your punishment is in large part determined by the economic impact of your crime. And so there is a range under federal law, so 6 months to 2 years for killing an eagle. Well, that eagle has value. Those feathers you trafficked have value. And by really adding all that up, the judge is thereby authorized, if not mandated, to throw the book at them. And that's been an interesting process over the years. And the sad thing is, many of the people against whom I've testified have in fact been Native Americans who, while on the one hand have cultural ties to the eagles, on the other hand, they have members of the community that are just as greedy and money hungry as any other constituency. And they're selling things that are supposed to be part of their culture. Now, the changing range of bald eagles as they move away from these tidal rivers and large estuaries and bays, and this is happening all over the country, is bringing with it new threats, things that they've never dealt with before. Now, one of the things that we see very readily is as the habitat shrinks, the competition for that habitat increases proportionately. We get a lot of eagles in here that are simply injured by other eagles. In fact, last month, we had 2 eagles brought in at one time. They got into a fight in midair. And I hope I won't offend the eagle lovers in the audience by saying eagles are not necessarily the brightest bulbs on the avian Christmas tree. These birds clenched in midair and began tumbling to earth. Well, they were both too stubborn or whatever to turn loose. And when they hit the ground, it was with a rather spectacular thump. And then they stayed clenched together for 2 hours until rescuers could finally get there and separate them. One of them was pretty badly beaten up. The other one we released within about a week. And yet it's a common injury now. An eagle has 500 pounds of pressure in the grip of its feet over needle sharp talons. They can do a lot of damage when they get you in their grasp. Now, as they move into the secondary and tertiary habitats, fish aren't available, so they've got to find food where they can find food. And they're scavenging. They're scavenging roadkill, which puts them in harm's way of automobile collisions, now one of the most common injuries we see, and gets them in trouble with human conflict because we have particularly young bald eagles here in the Shenandoah Valley, which is a major poultry producing region of the country. Young bald eagles figure out they can catch a chicken pretty quickly. But if you look real carefully right here in this picture, and I'm not sure the cat in the picture was actually killed by the bald eagle is more likely roadkill picked up by the eagle and brought back to its chicks. But we hear lots and lots of stories about eagles picking up dogs and carrying them away. And of course, the truth is you don't really want to buy a used car from anybody telling such a story, but it's still a widely held belief that an eagle can do a lot of damage to animals that are much larger than themselves. So one of the other problems we're seeing with increasing frequency is toxicity and foreign objects killing bald eagles. The toxicity is there, the poisons, the foul things they eat off of a landfill, they're drawn by other predators. And when we occasionally get them in, we had one bird that was picked up by workers at a landfill from here in Virginia. He was seriously disabled. Well, he didn't survive, and we found just all kinds of stuff inside him. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. But the roads, not only are these birds being hit by cars, they're doing damage to cars. This is a tractor trailer truck. I guess, no, actually, this is a bus. And the bird came through the windshield and actually survived, interestingly enough. We've had them stuck in the grills of automobiles. You never say never in this business. I'll just put it that way. I was mentioning the bird feeding at the landfill. This one came in and died. And on the necropsy or the postmortem exam, this is just some of the stuff we pulled out. Balloons, one of my particular favorite things to hate. A push pin for a bulletin board. This is bits of plastic, styrofoam, other non-digestible material, not food items. It essentially just clogged this bird's ability. Its crop was clogged, couldn't take in nutritious food, and more or less starved to death. Now, one of the big issues that we face with bald eagles today is an environmental contaminant that we could get rid of pretty quickly, and that is lead toxicity from spent ammunition. Now, people ask me all the time, I've been a lifelong gun collector and hunter, and people say, well, why all of a sudden is lead poisoning an issue? Because we've been using lead for bullets for about 600 years. Well, in some cases, it may not be a completely new problem, but for another reason, it is a new problem. We certainly are able to detect it more easily than we ever could before. This little machine right here is actually to measure the amount of lead in the blood of children. And this has become the most popular model now used in wildlife medicine. We are using, because those of us who do this type of sophisticated testing, communicate pretty consistently with one another. We're all using the same machine, all using the same test, so that indeed our results are all comparable. So we're seeing the problem more than we could even 20 years ago, but it was still a problem back then. But today, we now test all bald eagles coming in here. And I think last year we received 42, 48 bald eagles, on average between 40 and 50 a year. More than 70% of these birds have measurable lead in their bloodstreams. Now, certainly this was a huge problem for the California condor. And the state of California, in response to that, rather ham-fistedly simply banned lead from hunting ammunition and phased it out over 5 years. There are a lot of folks out there that were pretty unhappy about that. And a lot of the hunters out there have just made no bones about it. They're not going to change. But the fact is that lead in the bloodstream of these animals is the new DDT. And a shard of lead the size of a grain of rice, it takes very, very, very small amounts of soft, pure lead to dissolve in the digestive tract of the animal. And here you can see these are two little buckshot pellets. Each of these pellets is smaller than a green pea. This bird did not survive. Well, let's see, I shouldn't say that. I need to go back and look this up. In this case, because they were right there, we could go in surgically and remove these pellets and treat the bird. If these fragments have been there for any length of time, however, the response of birds is different from, say, coyotes that scavenge. they don't die from lead poisoning nearly at the rates that other avian scavengers do. And the reason being that when that lead gets into their digestive tract, it quite literally shuts down the whole digestive tract, but the digestive juices are still there. The acid in the stomach and in the intestine still breaking down the lead, but the lead's not moving through. So they simply cannot pass it out of their bodies. And it just continues to break down, get into their bloodstream until it either kills them outright or creates enough damage that it will kill them indirectly. Now, if we get them in time, we can treat it. But lead toxicity is entirely preventable. Now, it's going to be a hard battle to try and force this through, but it can be overcome with a different way of doing it. Now, how are they getting it? How are they getting these bullet fragments? Well, the truth is that as they move away from eating fish in tidal environments, estuaries and rivers, they're moving further from the water and they're just not going to make the trip. So they eat what's available. They can't find their preferred diet, so they will actually specialize. We are now seeing eagles that specialize in certain types of upland prey. Some of them have become quite adept at hunting, some of them at becoming nuisance predators at poultry farms and things of this nature, but they will often develop specialties. And since they're not agile predators to catch rabbits and squirrels, they may occasionally, but not very often. Most of the time, it's roadkill, it's scavenging dead animals that have been hit by cars and run off and die, or animals or animal remains that have been shot by hunters. Now, the remains of animals, I hear from all the time, I don't shoot a deer to leave it in the field. No, but all of us who grew up with a hunting tradition learned to field dress an animal. That is, remove its internal organs so that the meat that you do intend to use isn't spoiled by the decaying internal organs. So that gut pile that is left in the field, originally you thought you were doing something good by leaving it for scavengers, because in a matter of 24 to 48 hours after a deer is killed in a forested area or on open plains, the remains, the internal organs are gone. Avian scavengers account for a lot of that, certainly black vultures, turkey vultures, ravens, crows, a lot of the smaller birds, a lot of the smaller raptors. But now it is very, very common to see bald eagles sitting on these remains. Now, the average bullet used by a person who hunts with a high-powered rifle, as an example, as it passes through the animal, will lose 40% of its total bullet weight. Now, this particular deer, we did a study actually with a local group of high school kids at a governor's school for science and technology. And they wanted here in a rural part of Virginia, they're whiz kids, but they're still country kids. And a lot of them hunt, a lot of their families are just chock full of hunters. And so they wanted to know, is it really true? If you shoot a deer, you've got a bullet hole going in one side and out the other. But is it really true that the lead is then shed in particles? And here is a perfect example. This is the X-ray of the chest cage, or the rib cage, the chest cavity of a deer that was shot by a hunter. This is the bullet path that went through. The deer was quartering away from the hunter, which is kind of going away at a little bit of an angle. The deer was shot right under the middle of the rib cage. It was actually an excellent shot, but all these little white dots are shards of lead. When you take an X-ray, all of that lead shows up simply as a white opacity, as we call it. But a piece of lead the size of that right there is close to being enough to kill an eagle. We share these pictures with hunters. A lot of them are shocked because when they take home these animals, process them for the table, put them in the freezer, there's a bunch of this lead left in them. And indeed, the teacher who organized this study with students from Rockingham County, Virginia, brought in a whole bunch of processed venison from his own freezer. And we found lead fragments in 1 out of 3 of the frozen packages that he brought in, which had a way of really waking up a lot of people. You know, you don't want bald eagles eating it, but you sure don't want to feed it to your kid. And that has become a huge issue. So for an average rifle bullet that weighs, say, 165 grains, which is much, much less than an ounce, it will lose 40% of its weight as it passes through and opens up. So this bullet is designed to impact here. And as it does, the term of art is mushrooming. And as it mushrooms, it splays out to become more lethal. And as it does, it reveals, it's got a copper jacket on it, but that jacket opens. It's designed to open right at the serrations in the middle, and the soft lead is exposed. And that lead sheds off throughout the entire wound channel and up to 18 inches away from where the bullet actually impacts. That's a problem. And a lot of times, as it passes through a prey animal, the fragments end up in the internal organs. So the problem with lead is it's not like the animal can get it and then get over it. Lead is cumulative. Lead is a soft, heavy metal, and the body, eagle bodies and human bodies, have no way to eliminate it from our systems. Now, there are treatments. Lead will bind with calcium. So if the lead is still in the blood, we use a process called chelation, which is the intravenous injection of a compound that is basically a calcium suspension. As that circulates in the bloodstream, the free lead will bind to the calcium, and the calcium can be eliminated through the kidneys. For the birds that are not treated, eventually that lead in their bloodstream will bind with their bones and remain in their bodies, leaching out over time, doing permanent damage to nerves, to internal organs, to eyesight. And if it doesn't kill the bird directly from the overt toxicity, it certainly will compromise the bird that it is not able to function normally in the wild. And of the eagles we get, as I said, 70% or more have measurable lead. Well, half of those birds, about 35% of the birds that come into our hospital each year, die from lead intoxication. And they simply don't get over it. And it's only going to get worse. Now, there are options available. As I say, it's preventable. I've been a hunter all of my life, although not a terribly committed one in the recent decade, but there are non-lead alternatives available for high-powered rifles, which is the most common rifle used for big game. The bullet, the projectile itself, is an engineered solid copper bullet in this case, and it really does a good job for small game hunters or people shooting the pest in the garden. Even 22 caliber ammunition is available, and what they call green ammo, or essentially non-lead. A 22 bullet here in the East, groundhogs are our big nemesis on the farms and in the gardens. A groundhog shot with a 22 bullet, that bullet often will remain relatively intact. And if a scavenging bird swallows that bullet whole, it's a dead bird. The bullet does not stop killing simply because it stops moving. There are even non-lead alternatives for people who shoot handguns or even traditional weapons. You Westerners will appreciate the such things as the cowboy action shooting competitions that are very popular here. But traditional calibers of weapons that include 45 long Colt, the most famous, the Peacemaker, the cowboy gun. They now make non-lead alternatives for those types of guns and firearms as well. For shotguns, we banned lead for waterfowl hunting in the early 1990s because we were losing a documented 4 million ducks and geese per year to and these were harvestable waterfowl, to lead intoxication. And now that wasn't from the same access pathway. This was lead fired over wetlands, and the birds would ingest it, believing it to be grit. But we knew what lead can do, and we know what it has done. So this is the impact of lead is not a new knowledge. It's the pathway through which eagles are getting it that has changed as their habitat has changed. And even for those who like primitive weapons, as they're called, muzzle loaders, flintlocks, percussion firearms, they make non-lead ammunition or projectiles for those as well. If you want to avoid the problem, there are options and opportunities. And of course, here at the Wildlife Center of Virginia, we are pushing this very heavily. We work very closely with our state wildlife agency and with other wildlife professionals around the country to promote this. Voluntarily, it is the easiest pathway to get there, and legislatively and regulatorily is going to be a much, much bigger fight, but it may come to that. Now, the truth is, a lot of hunters are very resistant to change, and they say, oh, well, you know, it's not as good. Well, that's just not true. Lead ammunition is something people are used to, but copper ammunition in many ways is ballistically superior, not just because it's non-toxic. I couldn't resist the opportunity to show off a little bit. This is a target. I bought a new rifle about a year and a half ago. This is, there are 4 bullet holes here at a distance of 100 yards. That little black square is 1/2 inch on each side. These 4 bullet holes are less than a 1/2 inch apart at 100 yards, and these are copper bullets. So when people say to me, and these out here, this was operator error out here, so this one is almost an inch off of dead center. But when people say they're not consistent, they don't shoot as accurately, I'm here to tell you, I know that is simply not true. They talk about the bullet weight. Okay, copper is not as dense as lead, so a bullet of the same size doesn't carry as much of a punch using the same powder load. Well, the truth is it does, because being lighter, it travels at a higher speed. And the force generated is mass times velocity. If the mass is slightly lower, but the velocity is higher, the impact is precisely the same. And the big thing that's valuable to know is that these copper bullets retain 95% of their weight as they pass through the prey animal. So, and what's left behind, maybe a little sliver of copper, is not in fact toxic to these scavenging birds. Now, active conservation of eagles is still going on. We're not doing captive breeding much anymore across the country, and certainly not for conservation ends. But at organizations like the Wildlife Center of Virginia and many other fine rehabilitation centers and hospitals, there are a couple up in the Phoenix area. You've got a fine wildlife rehab program there in Tucson. And a lot of things are taking place. Now, certainly for many of us, we have specialized facilities and enclosures in which we can rear eagle chicks. As I say, eagles don't always make the right decisions for the right reasons. A common thing, especially here in the East, where we've had a big population for a long time, is they use the same nest year after year after year, and they add to it year after year after year, oftentimes making the nest so large and so heavy that the tree in which the nest is built can't support it any longer, and the tree falls over, spilling out nest and contents. Now, these 3 chicks had been, I saw somebody referencing earlier watching the South Florida nest cam. These 3 chicks came from the nest cam that existed for a long time at the Norfolk, Virginia Botanical Garden. And these 3 had been watched by hundreds of thousands of people worldwide. Well, their mother was killed by an airplane. Their parents didn't situate the nest all that well, putting it right next to the runway of the Norfolk International Airport. And mother was carrying a big old catfish across to feed these babies. And US Airways plane coming in for a landing struck her, killing her and doing $150,000 worth of damage to the plane. Well, the State Wildlife Agency knew very quickly that this had happened. They also knew that the male of this pair was not going to be able to successfully raise 3 chicks, maybe 1. The other 2 would undoubtedly be pushed out of the nest. And they also knew that with 100,000 people looking over their shoulders, life as they knew it was not going to be pleasant. So they did what any good government agency would do. They passed the buck. They climbed the tree, got the babies out, and brought them to the Wildlife Center of Virginia. We get a lot of bald eagles every year. And as the population has grown, so too has our patient load. And each and every one tells us something new. Each and every one gives us an insight to the environmental or oftentimes human decision-making problems that affect eagles. We still get the overt, deliberate criminal acts, but today, more often, we're getting the evidence of habitat loss and the fact that the birds are struggling to find their way in areas for which they are not instinctively suited. Now, we release a lot of these birds every year. One of my favorite things to do, and being the president of this organization, I get to do the fun stuff more than anybody else. So I have probably released 100 bald eagles over the years, and everyone's different, everyone's special, and no two are the same. Sometimes it's spectacular and the birds put on a terrific demonstration. I released one bird a few years ago that flew off immediately out of sight and then all of a sudden came back and gave everybody a spectacular show as it swooped down over the crowd that had gathered to watch the release and then promptly pooped all over them, which was, I guess, his way of saying thank you or something. But it's a very important part of our education process that we have people participate in these releases. Now, those three chicks that I mentioned here, when we released those birds, we actually had two others that we had come in from other nests, birds that were just normal old birds. They weren't famous. When we released these three rock stars, as they came to be known, and the two also ran eagles, we had 1,300 people come from across the United States to observe this because they'd watched these birds from the time the parents fixed the nest, laid the eggs, the babies were hatched, and a lot of people were pretty invested in that. As we release them, a lot of times we are able to do post-release studies. We've affixed cellular technology tracking devices to many of the birds. And what we find is that these birds raised in captivity, if they are raised properly in captivity, and our facility has cavernous enclosures where they can fly, and we literally put live fish on indoor pools. They can learn to catch fish. These birds do just fine out in the wild. The birds that we release, we never know what they're going to do. Some of them will release them near where we find them, and they'll stay right there for years. Others, we released some on the eastern shore of Virginia, out on the Atlantic coast, two siblings that had come out of a nest in a campground. One of the siblings stayed right there. The other one, the week after we released it, flew 2,000 miles up to the maritime provinces of Canada, spent the summer up there, and then came back to the campground where it had hatched. And it has done that each year for the last 4 or 5 years. Why? Who knows? Because he can, but we're learning a lot. But truly, public education and the type of work that the Tucson Audubon Society and the Desert Museum and the many other fine nature centers and conservation and environmental education organizations do in your part of the country, and indeed our colleagues nationwide and indeed worldwide. Conservation is a social science. Conservation means changing human behavior to achieve natural outcomes, hopefully beneficial to wildlife. Recovery of the bald eagle has been one of our greatest conservation success stories. It was at the brink of disappearing. We have brought it back to the point that it is not only in all of its traditional habitats, it's in places it's never been before. And that is a good thing. Continued vigilance, however, is needed. It's not enough to simply find the birds, take them to somebody who will fix a broken wing and turn them loose if they're not finding out how that bird got the wing broken in the first place. That's an important part of it. More research is still needed. We're documenting the lead. We pretty much have the lead figured out. We know what it is. We know where they're getting it. We know that it's ammunition because we've done chemical assays on the metallic substances recovered from the birds and from the lead recovered from the bloodstream. So we know it's ammunition. There's no question about that. It's been documented, it's been published. But until we change public perception fully and indeed, in some cases, still change the laws. The last administration had a um, Solicitor General in the Department of the Interior that basically changed over 100 years of migratory bird law by saying that the Migratory Bird Treaty Act only would be prosecuted by federal officials if they deliberately killed migratory birds. So if you have an accidental oil spill and kill 4,000 eagles, as was the case with the Exxon Valdez spill in Alaska, oops, it was an accident. You didn't mean to do it. And under that ruling, that has yet to be changed, by the way, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service would not be prosecuting. A lot of the states, including here in Virginia, we have now passed state laws that compensate for the federal government's declaration that they were no longer going to protect migratory birds when business activities or human development activities compromise them. We need to get this right. When you win something, you have to watch it forever and keep that vigilance going. But if you lose it and it's gone forever, you can go home and drink a beer. Public education is indeed the true answer to this. Getting people involved and engaged, getting people out to see these birds. I've been privileged to go birding all over the world, and I can tell you that taking groups to Africa, as I've done now about 25 times, we took a group of birders from here in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and in 10 days, they logged 300 species of birds on their life lists. And it was just an amazing experience. And the people who learned the most from that were the guides leading our group. They were there showing people elephants and lions and rhinos, and they thought that's all anybody wanted to see. When they found out how much diversity was there, how much interest there was in the avian species around them, this company now specializes in birding trips for safari goers. And it's been a two-way educational street. But the truth is, the bald eagle is not only our national symbol and the apex predator in its food chain, it is the iconic species of the entire natural world. And the future's in our hands. As go the eagles, so goes everything else. I want to thank some folks for their pictures and for their information. But above all, I want to encourage you, please go to our website and visit. There's so much more there. You can go to wildlifecenter.org. I heard Luke say he was going to share the presentation and some links. When you get to our website, do a search function on lead toxicity. We've got extensive publications there, and it deals with all aspects of this issue in far greater detail than I could approach today. Go to that search box and type in Untamed, all capital letters, 204. What is Untamed, you may ask? It's our weekly series on public television. The Wildlife Center has had 2 seasons now of a weekly series on wildlife conservation. And right now it's being broadcast mainly in Virginia, but we were just informed that 90 PBS affiliates across the country are picking up season 2 of Untamed for broadcast. And there is one in Arizona. I don't know if they're broadcasting in your area. I should have looked that up, but you can find all of the episodes on our website and encourage you to enjoy them. And on our website, particularly related to lead and wildlife, under the first tab on the opening screen, there's a list of publications. You just scroll down, there's a publication on lead and wildlife. It's a PDF file you can download, you can share with others. It answers the questions hunters will have, and it really addresses this issue in a comprehensive way. So thank you for your attention. I hope you found some of it interesting. And now I'll unshare my screen and we'll take some questions if there are any.
Hey, Ed, thank you so much. That was really wonderful. And I really appreciated how you started off the presentation by talking about how the health of the environment, health of animals, health of humans, how it's all interconnected and each one is important together. I think that speaks volumes right there. So thank you for that. We do have a few questions.
I hope.
Yeah, we do. One of the questions, a few had to do with lead poisoning from the fishing industry. Is there anything that you could share as far as like whether lead weights are an issue from?
Lead in fishing tackle is very definitely a huge issue. It's not as much an issue in eagles, although we have extracted fishing lures. In fact, somewhere back here on my shelf, I've got a fishing lure we took out of a bald eagle that he had swallowed. And yet where we're located out in the mountains in the western part of Virginia, we're not getting birds that are as frequently interacting with fishing tackle as we would if we were in coastal areas. So it is a huge issue. We know that our colleagues around the country see it quite a lot. I have heard on good authority that some of the initiatives that were carried out in the Obama administration, the closing days with some of our wildlife refuges, saying that lead ammunition and lead fishing tackle would no longer be able to be used on federal lands. All of that was immediately overturned by the past administration. I've heard that there is at least a discussion underway, particularly related to lead fishing tackle, that some of those things may be reinstated. Fishing tackle is a particular problem for swan species, for loons, for fishing and diving birds like that.
Yeah, I think I was looking up some information on it. It looked like a lot of it had to do with common loons and how it was the lead weights were not allowed as certain lakes where loons were at. When it comes to DDT, there's a question about how the DDT would get into the eagle's system. Was that from like the fish that it would eat and
yeah, it's a food chain manifestation. DDT was used to kill insects. Those insects were on agricultural crops. They were on people. DDT is credited with stopping lice-borne epidemics after World War II. People coming to the United States from Europe, refugees, were dusted with DDT to kill head lice or other ectoparasites. And so on the one hand, DDT actually contributed tremendously to human health and safety to a point. But those insects would then be eaten by small birds. The chemicals on the plants would be eaten by herbivorous animals, and essentially it builds up in the food chain. Well, I would explain it is, and of course the runoff then got into the fish. And the way I explained the cumulative effects of DDT is very much like the cumulative effects of lead. They could take in a small amount that in and of itself might not be harmful at all. In the same way that, you get exposed to something that's carcinogenic, but if it's a brief exposure, so what? Well, the chronic exposure, it's like picking up a pebble and putting it in your pocket. Well, that pebble the first day is insignificant, and maybe after a week of picking them up one at a time, you're aware of it, but it's not going to cripple you up. But eventually, if you keep adding to that exposure, the cumulative weight of the burden you bear, whether it's chemical or literal, will take you down. And that's what happened with the DDT. The eagles concentrate it at the top of the food chain.
Do you know if DDT is being used in any other countries, or is it?
Oh, it certainly is. Certainly, yeah. DDT is still used widely around the world. And until recently, a lot of the chemicals that were banned for use in the United States were still made in the United States and then exported for use in other countries. The changes that we effected in the federal law called FIFRA, the Fungicide, Insecticide, Rodenticide Act, which is the Federal Pesticide Regulatory Act, now says that if a chemical is banned in the United States, that no country may export to the United States any food product or other product that contains residues of the chemical banned. We had a more recent example of that with the chemical Furidan. In 1985, the very first bald eagle we got here in Virginia from one of the 50 nesting pairs in the state had been intoxicated, was poisoned with an agricultural chemical. We managed to find out it was the chemical carbofuran, or sold under the trade name Furadan, in a soybean field, as I recall. We found out through our investigation, and I say our, I mean the Wildlife Center of Virginia, that that chemical was known to EPA to be killing 2 million birds a year when used according to label instructions. In the next 24 months, the following 2 years, we had 6 bald eagles that were either dead or poisoned by the chemical. And we worked with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, documented what it was, and it took us several years. Well, it took us almost 10 years, really, but we finally got carbofuran banned from all uses in the United States. And it all started with one bald eagle. And that's what I say, is that's the example I often use, how one bird and its experience, and we did save it, we released the bird, but one bird gave us an insight that helped us save 2 million non-target birds per year. And that was about 27, 28 years ago. So you do the math.
Yeah, yeah, that's impressive. As bald eagles have expanded their range and moved into areas where they weren't normally there, do you see any competition with other raptors like golden eagles?
Well, not so much, at least not here, because here in Virginia, our golden eagle population is very seasonal. So we get them in the far western corner of the state, and they're only here in December and January. And so there really is not much competition. They will often be seen where they do overlap on the same carcass. And so the competition is not population competition, more individuals over a given food item.
Yeah.
At least here.
Yeah. You may know the answer to this question, may not. Do you happen to know the percent of hatchlings that live to be breeding age, bald eagles?
The number of bald eagles that live to be to breeding age is
Yeah.
it's about 1 out of 3 to 1 out of 4. So when we talk about calculating values, one of the factors that we use was how many have to be born, or hatched, I should say, in order to produce one adult of breeding age. And it's typically 1 out of 3 is the last information that I've gotten. We're actually seeing some tremendous reproductive rates in some of our nests here in the east, simply because the birds have gotten so accustomed to living around people that they just don't let anything bother them anymore. Back in the 1980s, there was a study done at Virginia Tech that showed eagles in the Chesapeake Bay region had what they call a flushing distance, the distance you could approach them before they would fly away. And the figure they came up with back then was 400 yards. And so 300 yards became the figure that the endangered species authorities would use to protect habitat around an eagle nest. Now you can't scare the things out of the garden. You know, I mean, it's just it's quite a change. And that really is an adaptation that probably not evolutionary, but certainly dramatic and measurable and observable.
Yeah, that's something else. That's pretty interesting. One last question here. I'm going to read it to make sure I get it right. Have they discovered the reason so many bald eagles were found dead over the last couple of years in the Maryland Eastern Shore?
Yeah, we sure have. We sure have. And actually, we were involved in that. The chemical that I just mentioned banning, carbofuran or Furadan, that chemical came in a granular form, and farmers knew it would kill anything. I mean, just anything. And when it became public notice that, or common news that it was going to be banned, a lot of people stocked up on it because they used it not only in agricultural, but in pest control applications. And all of those birds, there were 13 on one carcass, every last one of them was poisoned with carbofuran. So a lot of that was kept quiet as federal authorities did their investigations. They got some people, they didn't get them all, but it was very definitely, it was a chemical that has now been banned, a chemical that is no longer sold, but a chemical that people kept in order to misuse.
Wow. Any last questions for Ed? I think we exhausted all of them. I think I got to all of them. And yeah, thank you, Ed, so much for being with us. I always like to end the presentation by inviting people to unmute themselves and verbally thank our presenters. Just as a reminder, I'll be sending out the recording here pretty soon to everyone, along with these links and along with those 3 different items that you asked us to search: lead toxicity, Untamed 204, and PDF to publications for lead and wildlife. So,
well, as you go to our website, Luke, and to all of your members and our guests here today, Untamed covers a wide variety of topics. We've got from season 1 programs on owls, on vultures, on other avian species. Season 2, we talked a lot about migration and a lot of the issues there. So you'll find a lot in our various programs. And as I say, they're all there. They're all free. There are no commercials. And for each and every one of the programs, there are also education materials that are available for use if you know or have any contact with teachers or homeschoolers. A lot of stuff there. So we really hope you'll use it. Let us hear from you.
and one last thing, I just want to really thank the Friends of Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge, especially Janine. Janine Higgins was instrumental in getting all of this going and connecting me with you, Ed. So big thanks to Janine and everyone there. I'll put a link to Buenos Aires, Friends of Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge in the follow-up email too. So huge props to them.
Okay, thank you all so much.
Thank you. That
Thank
was
you.
Great job, everyone.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great presentation.
Thanks. Visit our
That's always my favorite part.
visit our website. All right, thank you all
All
so
right,
much.
Ed.
Thank
Have a
you.
great day. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.